Let me start again then. Welcome to the keynote of this, the first keynote of the workshop, Reading Zoos in the Age of the Anthropocene, subtitled Exhibition, Curation, Decolonization. I'm very happy to be able to welcome Louise Green as our first keynote speaker. Louise is Associate Professor in the English Department at Stellenbosch University and the author, most recently, of the wonderful book, beautiful, I recommend you all go out and buy it, Fragments from the History of Loss, the Nature Industry and the Post-Colony, which came out last year with Penn State University Press. Louise is interested in critical theory, studies in modernity and globalization, and tracing the elusive, mobile, and diverse formations of value in late capitalist society. And her research proposes Africa as an important site for philosophical engagement with the universalizing impulse that marks contemporary narratives of environmental crisis. And her talk this evening is entitled A Zoo and Its Public, the Short Life and Slow Decline of a Colonial Menagerie, which focuses, or she will be focusing on the complicated legacy of the Groote Schuur Zoo, or in Cape Town, formerly known as the Rhodes Menagerie, exploring the messy and often failed attempts to conceptualize and manage human-animal relationships in the context of 20th century South Africa. We can't really applaud in this forum except virtually, but please join me in welcoming Louise Green, and I invite her to take the stage.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction and for alerting people to my book. I have to say, and as I've already said earlier, I'm not an expert in zoos, but I have written in this book on two exhibitions of, there's the book, two exhibitions of African nature, one at the American Museum of Natural History and one at the Eden Project in Cornwall. And in both of these exhibitions, I look at the way in which the rainforest is represented and the kind of implications of a continuing kind of imperial gaze that we can't seem to escape, even though in many ways it has been superseded by other ideas about nature. The other thing I talk about in this book is game reserves, in particular the private game reserves, which are really proliferating all over Africa. But the zoo itself was a new area of study for me. And so I'm really interested in hearing your responses to this paper. As I explained earlier, it's new research for me, and I'm interested in your responses both to the content, but also to the form, because one of the things I'm interested in is the way in which we write about things and the effects different ways of writing about things has. So I've arranged this talk in a particular way around a series of what I call enclosures. So I'm also interested in what you think about this idea of the enclosure as a kind of methodological approach. All right, so I'm going to start then with the first enclosure, and I've called it Trace. On a sunny winter's day in July 2021, photographer Nick Eldridge and I visited the site of Rhodes Menagerie on the lower slopes of Table Mountain next to the University of Cape Town. After a year and a half of intermittent lockdown and the closure of the university, I was not sure what to expect. Homelessness has increased exponentially during the pandemic, and I was not sure who might be living there and whether it would in fact be safe for me to explore the site on my own. In actual fact, on that day when we went there, we found the site deserted, except for a thin elderly white man who was occupying the lion's cage. He did not acknowledge our greeting and moved quietly away to avoid us, moving from a sloping bank behind the cage to a sunny spot inside, and then easing into one of the dark cell-like structures that lie behind the stone facade of the building. Researching the zoo many years previously, I had come across a series of photographs of the zoo from the 1890s. My first idea was to try and find the place from which these images were shot and to re-photograph the space, to create a record of change. But the site resisted such an orderly reinscription. Although the mountain behind was presumably unchanged, the site itself had been shaved at the front by the creation of a motorway, and then by a slipway to the university and some parking. Along the front, traces of old structures remained, some stone stairs, a line of rectangular stone blocks marking the edge of something, and many different species of trees and shrubs, now wild and overgrown. At the center of the place, where an entry might be, at the center of a place where an entrance might once have been, was a small tilted sign reading "No Entry." The sign marks off an enclosure which is entirely notional. What is being enclosed is traces, foundations, unnaturally flat spaces, paths, small derelict buildings that have become the canvas for graffiti artists, pieces of stone wall. Only the lion cage remains intact, a large stone building with a rocky hill leading down steeply into a moat over which the lions could look out over the city. Since the zoo's closure in 1979, it has been used for trance parties, theatre performances, and fieldwork training for archaeology students. In 2012, an undergraduate student at the Center for Curating Archive at Michaelis School of Fine Art completed an ambitious project on the zoo, which she called Lacuna, Groote Schuur Zoo. In the introduction, she explains that she came across the site inadvertently and was confused and intrigued by its obscurity. My curiosity was only increased when I could not immediately find any information on the site. Her project involved photographing the site, investigating archival sources, and issuing a public invitation to elicit stories about and memories of the zoo. The project, she insisted, is not a nostalgic one. Instead, she maintains she is interested in the stories related to the space, because they illustrate how layers of meaning bound to the site have changed over time. When I read the stories gathered by Sarah Omaneh about the zoo, I recalled that my father too had a zoo story. As a student in the 1950s at UCT, he and his friends used to borrow blue cranes from the zoo and take them to parties. They were given alcohol and would stalk around pecking at the feet of unsuspecting guests. Presumably, at the end of the party, they were returned to the aviary. One night, another young man decided to imitate their exploit, but drunkenly entered the wrong cage. Instead of the stately crane, he encountered an annoyed ostrich, which chased him. I do not now remember if he was injured or merely startled, managed to fly over the fence in time. By the time Omaneh was collecting her stories in 2012, my father was already beginning to suffer from dementia and would probably not have remembered that story. But animals still seemed to haunt his brain. Some years later, when I was visiting him in the frail car unit where he was living, he asked me, Are crocodiles causing a lot of trouble in the East? I could not help laughing. It was such a wonderfully open-ended question. He laughed too, almost as if he recognized that somewhere language had let him down, but still seemed to expect an answer. I said I did not think so. He thought for a moment, and as if striving for a more accurate expression of his thoughts, asked, "Are crocodiles causing a lot of trouble in the West?" Where did these crocodiles come from? Were they dredged up from memories of surveying for a Rhodes in what was then Southwest Africa? From trips with his intrepid father down various southern African rivers? Or had they presented themselves from the seemingly endless nature programs on television that served as a permanent distraction for the residents? Whatever the origin of these particular crocodiles, they testify to a particular colonial fantasy about wild animals and status, and an investment in the idea of the exploit. The second enclosure I have called design. The concept of the exploit has become an important one for my understanding of the particular form of colonial engagement with nature. I first came across the term used in this way as a noun in a very different context, in the work of Thorstein Veblen. In his famous book, Theory of the Leisure Classes, he explains the organization of society through making a distinction between activities designated as honorific, which include hunting and warfare, and those dismissed as drudgery, such as productive labor. With infinite contempt and meticulous detail, Veblen outlines the way in which the leisure classes, and he's writing at the end of the 19th century, perform in attenuated form the rituals of status associated with much earlier societies, through performances of leisure and increasingly performances of consumption, since in modern society, leisure has become something which is difficult to display publicly. Of course, the word exploit has another and in many ways more familiar meaning. I'm quoting from my book here. As a noun, it refers to brilliant feat, but behind this meaning is an earlier one, the idea of an endeavor to gain mastery or advantage. In its verb form, the idea of mastery, to utilize for selfish purposes, to make capital out of, exists alongside the more neutral, to work or to turn to account. The colonial exploit is never far from the different and darker activity of exploitation. In my book, I include a chapter on what I call the primitive accumulation of nature. In it, I discuss a series of photographs from the town of Kimberley during the Diamond Rush. Rhodes is, of course, a central figure in the story of mineral extraction in South Africa, and it is his successful establishment of a monopoly at the diamond fields that finances his purchase of Groote Schuur estate and his establishment of the menagerie. In discussing the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at UCT, I suggest that the statue of Rhodes, the particular statue that the students took down, the statue of Rhodes offered a material manifestation of something that is far more ineffable, a particular vision of value, status, and distinction. And Veblen's distinction between exploit and drudgery provides a useful way of parsing the terms of this colonial ideology. From the late 19th century, the period of colonial expansion, Africa becomes the domain of the exploit, a space in which certain set of predatory activities could acquire honorific status. One way in which this status was achieved was through the acquisition of wealth through seizure or primitive accumulation. And the other way involved conspicuous display. And it is interesting to consider the particular role wild animals play in this display. Rhodes envisaged a lion house for the zoo that would be built on classical lines. Plans for such a building were drawn up by Herbert Baker and can be found in the Manuscripts and Archives Division of the University of Cape Town. In his essay, First Thoughts on the Site of Groote Schuur Zoo, archaeologist Nick Shepherd describes the envisaged cage. The plans that Baker drew for the lion house show a substantial colonnade, some 60 meters in length, enclosing a hollow square. Pillars line the sides and a series of arched openings lead to the central courtyard. The lions were to wander freely through the structure, threading their way through pillars or romping in the courtyard. In his hagiographic biography of Rhodes, the architect Herbert Baker describes the project in this way. The lion house was planned to be a spacious and beautiful building. A pastum temple was in his mind, where the king of the beasts would be admired for his natural strength and dignity. The old Roman in him pictured the beauty of lions moving through great columns, and he was quite unperturbed when warned of the sanguinary fights which would ensue. Shepherd refers to the lion house, which was never built, as a ghostly presence in the landscape, an anti-cage, or an allegory of a cage. He notes that it speaks to the heart of Rhodes' vision or fantasy of the role of Europe in Africa. And I'm quoting Shepherd here. The classical temple, order, harmony, beauty, contains and directs the coiled energy of the wild lions, which otherwise are dissipated in chaos. The extravagant pillars, arches, and courtyards of the imagined lion house construct a backdrop for the lions, separate and different from their natural habitat. Different also from their actual context, which was carefully designed. Different also from their actual context, which the carefully designed but somewhat random collection of species that formed Groote Schuur Zoo. Instead, the material lions would have been invited to become actors in a staging of a classical drama of wildness and order, a drama in which violence was assumed to play a natural part. And separated from its symbolism, the lion house in its excess would have provided additional testament to Rhodes's pecuniary strength, and that's a phrase that Veblen uses. Basically, Rhodes's wealth, his ability to use his wealth to impose his own meaning on the landscape. The second enclosure is notional in a different way from the first. The cage exists only in the realm of promise, fantasy, and design. And thinking with the logic of synecdoche, we can read this cage as a part which stands for an impossible whole. The third enclosure I have called image. The actual cage the lions inhabited at the Groote Schuur Zoo was very different from Rhodes's imagined lion house. In a set of photographs from the 1890s, which I came across almost by chance in the South African Library, the lion cage is revealed to be a small, barred enclosure. It is located in a row of similar cages. A description of the zoo in a magazine from 1908 makes it possible to interpret the blur of fur, which is just over there, blur of fur behind, in the cage behind, as a species of dingo. In the photograph, a young white woman can be seen looking at the lions through the bars of the cage. She appears to be wearing some form of uniform. For me, photographs, and particularly photographs of landscapes and animals, at first always resist interpretation, presenting themselves as fragments of reality and records of the past. This particular photograph of the girl and the lions presents the zoo as an orderly, well-managed space where human and animal can encounter each other without risk. On one side of the bars, the lion and lioness seem to form an animal family, calmly occupying their domain. On the other side, the girl, dressed neatly and respectably in sensible clothing and a hat, looks on with a quiet, dispassionate gaze. Despite the bars, it generates the effect of peace, calm, even reverie. This is partly the effect of the background. Behind the cage lies a dense stand of pines, and above and beyond that, the buttress of Devil's Peak. As if the lions were but for the small matter of bars in their natural habitat. In fact, the background is in some ways more important than the foreground, because what makes this zoo singular is not so much the somewhat random collection of animals. It is not a particularly magnificent collection, but rather it is its location. It is a zoo in Africa, where abstract European ideas about the symbolic value of animals and their potency as ciphers in the invention of tradition can be tested in a confrontation with actual wild animals. Taken from a slight distance with a wide-angle lens, the photographs record reality, but also eliminate it. It leaves out the messy business of the zoo, the deaths that are needed to sustain these predators, the cost of upkeep, the unpredictability of the animals, and the risk to both human and animal in this encounter. The photograph deliberately reduces risk, but at the same time it is the existence of risk that provides the photograph and the zoo with its charge. The lioness standing looking out over the suburbs below appears to be living her own autonomous, if highly restricted life. But it is in fact as a material image or symbol that she functions in this zoo. The lion and the other animals of the zoo represent Rhodes's power and status. They are political animals, and he gains by association with them. And they suffer by association with him. This becomes obvious in a moment when Rhodes's political power is challenged. When Rhodes' support of the Jameson raid, which was the raid by the British into the Transvaal Republic in order to secure the gold that had been discovered there, the gold mines, the animals became the targets of political rage. And the following account is given of this by one of Rhodes's associates called Lasseur. And I'm reading a quote from him here. During 1896 and 1897, an extraordinary number of acts of vandalism were committed at Groote Schuur, put down to the scum of the supporters of Rhodes's opponents. When Rhodes returned from the north in 1898, no less than 19 fires had been started and fortunately extinguished on the estate. Nests of Eggs of valuable golden and other pheasants were smashed, and one night part of the aviaries was saturated with paraffin and set fire to. An attempt was made to liberate the lions, the bars of the cage being found bent to a width nearly sufficient to enable the lions to escape. 15 kangaroos, 18 ostriches and emus, and a number of other animals were killed in the paddocks by being knocked over the head with a knobkerrie, while 18,000 young camphor and oak trees, which Rhodes had planted in avenues for the benefit of later generations, were destroyed by simply being broken in half. None of the perpetrators of these outrages were ever caught. In this third enclosure, the cage itself is highly restrictive, but the image, the way the animal body is itself only the vehicle of cultural and political meanings, is extremely, and for the animals dangerously, open-ended. Fourth enclosure I've called newspaper, and I have to admit that this enclosure is the smallest enclosure in terms of the research and thinking that I've done about this particular period in the zoo's history. So this is very preliminary. After Rhodes' death, the Groote Schuur Zoo was left to an, at that time, imaginary entity, a unified South African nation. So the estate remained part of the Rhodes Trust until unification in 1910. And in 1911, the Department of Public Works was given responsibility for the zoo. What I am struck by is how quickly the zoo moves from being described as paradise, which is a phrase used about Rhodes Menagerie in 1897, where he talks about, a writer in the African Review talks about one of the greatest attractions is the paradise or park for wild beasts, to use the word's original Persian meaning, which Rhodes has instituted under the shadow of Table Mountain, to being described as a prison. It is praised as a valuable resource, but within 15 years it is also a problem. What exactly is its function? The collection of animals is somewhat random. The management is not scientific. The space is not modern. Although most of the oral testimonies Omine gathers are from a slightly later period, some include information dating back to this early history of the municipal zoo. Things appear a little chaotic. The first zookeeper dies of a lion bite. Dramatic claims are made about the state of the animals. A letter to the newspaper states that if present conditions are to continue indefinitely at the Groote Schuur prison house, the government and the council will find themselves at the end of these prolonged discussions and negotiations with a zoo minus its inhabitants. These will have solved the problem of their future by winning a happy release from their present miseries by that gate to freedom, namely death. That was a letter to the newspaper in 1928. At the same time, the American Consul General at the Cape cheerfully proposed a new function for the zoo. Speaking as a big game hunter, his principal hobby, Mr. Ralph Totten told a Cape Times representative yesterday that a new zoo on the Groote Schuur estate would be of great benefit to people, both from the Union and from overseas, going on hunting expeditions. Before leaving on a big game shoot, he said, it's always a good idea to refresh the mind as to what the animals look like. And this can be done in no better way than by seeing them against a natural background. An attempt is made to reconstruct the zoo, and the new lion cage, the one I showed you at the beginning, which currently still exists, is built according to Hagenbeck's design. 20 years later, however, the zoo is again subject to criticism. It is old-fashioned, inadequate, even a disgrace to the community. Again, the question of function is raised. Is its main aim preservation or education? The cages are not adequately labeled and there's no logic to the collection. The site is unsuitable. The zoo is an awkward sort of resource. It costs a lot to maintain. It requires scientific management. The role of the zoo in the preservation of indigenous species is raised. In another letter to the paper, Mr. Frank Talbot, who later went on to be director of the Smithsonian in Washington, said that there was no doubt that most South African zoos could be improved. Ours is possibly the worst in South Africa, he says. Its first and most important aim should be to give a full representation of Cape animals, and it doesn't even attempt to do that. The zoo continues in its disorganized way until 1979, when it is finally closed. This enclosure reflects the slow decline of the zoo as it becomes an anachronism, messy, marginal, and overshadowed by much larger and more urgent political concerns. The fifth enclosure I've called fiction. In Henrietta Rose Innes's novel, Green Lion, the zoo acquires a final iteration. With sly humor, Rose Innes takes fragments from contemporary reality and rearranges them to produce an altered and vaguely sinister future. At the beginning of the novel, the protagonist, Constantine, somewhat unwillingly visits the zoo after a traumatic incident in which a volunteer, Con's childhood friend Mark, has been mauled by one of the lions. This violence intrudes on the rational and educational display. The lion house in the novel has high ceilings and educational posters documenting the usual, this is a quote from the novel, climate change and countrywide drought, species loss, habitat decimation, the importance of keeping the fragile Table Mountain ecosystem closed off to people. The zoo is committed to promoting indigenous species, and the sign outside the lion's cage proudly announces, "Back from extinction, come and meet our breeding pair, Dimitri and Sekhmet, the first black-maned lions in the Cape since 1858. This promise is immediately undermined by the fact that Dimitri, who attacked the volunteer, has already been euthanized. In a conversation with the zoo manager, it emerges that neither Dimitri or Sekhmet were ever wild lions. Dimitri was acquired from a Russian zoo, and Sekhmet from a Namibian canned hunting operation. The novel gives a visceral account of the messiness of zoos, the smell of meat and blood and urine, the unpredictability of animals. It is a difficult space to manage, and like its real-life counterpart, there is anxiety about its function. The zoo is overshadowed by a larger enclosure, the fencing off, despite public protest, of the entire area of Table Mountain. This larger reserve remains somewhat mysterious. It has apparently been restocked with game, but no one is sure what animals might be up there. It is off limits, rumored to contain wild and dangerous animals. At the same time, it operates as an exclusive, high-end reserve for wealthy visitors. The enclosure of the mountain relies on physical barrier of the fence, threat of legal action, and rumors of danger. Yet it is clear from the start that the fence is a very porous boundary. As a boy, Con squeezes through it, as does his friend's little sister, who ultimately disappears into the wild space that it has come to represent. And later in the novel, when pursuing the lion Sekhmet, who has been released by a strange group of people Con refers to as hippies or animal nutters, he comes across a group of recreational hunters. with their expensive gear, which one kindly lends to Con, they resemble the hunter described by Veblen. Veblen is very contemptuous of these honorific activities when they are undertaken in an industrial society, when they're entirely pointless, he says. And Veblen classes hunting alongside angling and other sports as activities designed to show prowess. He presents the recreational hunter in industrial society as a caricatured figure. It is noticeable, for instance, that even very mild-mannered and matter-of-fact men, this is a quote from Veblen, who go out shooting are apt to carry an excess of arms and accoutrements in order to impress upon their imagination the seriousness of their undertaking. These huntsmen are also prone to a histrionic prancing gait and an elaborate exaggeration of the motion, whether of stealth or of onslaught, involved in their deeds of exploit. The hunters in the novel are determined to kill something, but even in this strange reserve, wild animals are in short supply. Eventually, one kills something that they all agree is an African wildcat, though Con notes everyone could see it was just a ginger tabby. The real lion, after one violent, deadly attack on a little girl, has disappeared into the world of urban legend. And I'm going to quote from the novel here. Although Sekhmet is gone, she still features regularly in newspaper reports. She is cited now and then in ever more fantastical circumstances, scaring off muggers in an alley off Long Street, or leaving footprints at the tomb of a Muslim saint in Four. She is held captive in a backyard shack in Lavender Hill and used in dogfights. She is further afield. A group of boys at initiation school in Transkei reported that she came strolling past their huts in the middle of the night. She is kept by a famous playboy in the Santon penthouse, brought out at parties, wearing a jeweled collar. There was one sight of Sekhmet in Durban, walking down the beachfront at sunrise. She has never been photographed. The novel ends happily enough for the protagonists. The zoo, without its key attraction of the lions, is reinvented through the donation of a set of taxidermized animals, mended and improved by a theatre group. The lion cage becomes a stage for a theatre production in which a puppet lion performs a touching contact or encounter with a little girl, laying its head in her lap. Yet the tone of the novel makes its overall effect disturbing and uncanny. Con, like Rose Innes's unnamed protagonist in the short story Poison, remains vague and passive, haunted by an overwhelming sense of guilt. And the world itself seems precarious. The world of Cape Town, at least, seems precarious. Small details which the characters themselves seem to barely register testify to the violent and ongoing destruction of the environment. So, in conclusion, by mimicking the logic of the zoo, I have presented these fragments from the history of the zoo by organizing them into enclosures. These enclosures are both forms of material containment, marked by signs or bars, fences, but also conceptual representational modes, which have in different ways tried to contain the zoo and mark its limits. In my book, I make use of Benjamin Adorno's notion of the constellation as a way of approaching the complicated, multi-dimensional nature of environmental crisis. Adorno's notion of the constellational historical image enables the assembly of diverse material, fragments that cannot be accounted for in a single system of knowledge. It allows for an arrangement in a conceptual three-dimensional space of personal experience, public desire, political event, and concrete scientific data, not in the mode of hierarchical or explanatory diagram, but so as to reveal the way in which each element asserts a gravitational pull on the other. With the enclosures, I have tried to do something similar. In the zoo, enclosure permits makes possible juxtaposition. The zoo itself, this particular zoo, involves unusual combinations. The lions and the dingoes lined up next to each other, the human and the lion also placed side by side. But the enclosure in the zoo promises order and containment in a way that the constellation does not. The zoo is at once an abstraction and a messy, demanding daily routine of cleaning, feeding, keeping alive, a dense concentration of restless and resistant lives that press up against the bars of their confinement. What I hope to have shown in these descriptions of the various iterations of the Groote Schuur Zoo is that the enclosures fail to hold. The containment, both material and conceptual, does not hold. Bars are prized open, fences are dug under, and lions slip out into the fictional city and become legend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always odd on Zoom. You can't hear any applause, but thank you very much for this very rich and exciting talk. Would you like to unshare your screen so we can see some other people?
Yes, unsharing.
Okay. And I would like to open the floor to any comments or questions. I can see Michaela and Ben have already had something to say. I don't know if they have a question for our speaker. Otherwise, anybody is welcome to come forward. All right, I guess everyone is still thinking about what you've presented here, which is the case with me as well. But I'm very. Let's maybe start at the end. I'm very struck by the. How shall I say this? I'm very intrigued by this, the question of the enclosure as a method, right? So that the way that you talk about the zoo is also so it's both a formal and a thematic aspect of the discussion of the zoo, and I find this really productive, also because in my own research into the zoo, I keep coming up against this, what I think is a bit of a problem, that it's everybody knows the story of the zoo, and the zoo, right? The zoo is either, and I mean, I think you also quote the Adorno text in your book about how the zoo is laid out on the model of Noah's Ark, and that this is the bourgeoisie is waiting for the flood, and so on. So there is this kind of, it's either the Garden of Eden or it's this kind of apocalyptic Noah's Ark. But in any case, there is a sort of automatism to the way that the zoo is always interpreted, and in a sense, the way that you encounter it and the way that it's used in popular culture, especially, you already know what the story is going to be. And so what I find really exciting about the way that you're talking about this, and very productive, is that you're focusing specifically on the way that the stories that we would like to tell about the zoo and the stories that the zoos like to tell about themselves don't actually contain even what the zoo is or what it could be. This isn't really a question, this is more sort of me thinking along, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the method of the fragment and the constellation and so on that you're working with.
Yeah, sure. So the book is arranged around this idea of the fragment, and Adorno's idea is not that the fragments have inherent meaning, but that you can arrange them in a particular way. And once you put them in a particular arrangement, he says it's like a riddle. You put things in arrangement and suddenly something is illuminated about the whole. And it's provisional. It's always provisional. So it's a nice way of engaging with objects and issues that are so complex and have so many dimensions. And the other thing that the constellation does in interesting ways is, and particularly Adorno, is he doesn't want a diagram or a way of arranging things which is hierarchical. So something is not an example of something else. He says it's more interesting to think about how there's a kind of friction which occurs when things are kind of bumped up against each other, and this releases a kind of insight which you would not get otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not entirely sure whether the enclosure can do exactly the same, but what I was struck with this zoo. I also struggled to know what to say about it in one sense. As you say, there's a kind of history to it that is quite straightforward at one level. But at the same time, it also doesn't seem contained by that story because it is such an awkward space. I mean, Omenes, I think, was actually a Dutch student, and she was so baffled by why this piece of land is just the same as it's been since 1979, more or less, and nothing happens with it. And there are plans to redevelop it, there are plans to do things with it, but it just actually remains as this kind of, a strange empty space which is contained by the sign from the national parks which says don't go in there, which of course everyone entirely ignores. So it's entirely pointless. And I mean, they have had people living there. I'm actually not quite sure why it was so empty when we went there. But maybe it has got to do with lockdown and the university security has probably got nothing else to do, given that there are no students on campus. So, what interests me about this is, the zoo is so much organized according to enclosures. But what interests me is the way in which things always are escaping that enclosure. And I'm not sure if this is very much a characteristic of South African zoos and South African fences, that no sooner that a fence goes up, then there's a way under it. And Rose Innes captures this, I think, in a very interesting way. So the enclosures don't keep people in or out. All right, I see there's a hand up, Gail.
I just wanted to say how amazing that photograph of the lions with the mountains in the background is. Just absolutely, and you can't help thinking, oh, Hagenbeck's just been blown out of the water, right? Like this, his kind of lion mountain, and you've got this incredible, background for the zoo. So it's kind of interesting in that way to read the Hagenbeck kind of, sculptures against the kind of actual, the terrain itself used as the panoramic machine. And the other thing I thought about the enclosure, which is a word I found to be quite resonant as well. And it kind of, that sort of thing about how you make something by enclosing it. You don't just kind of keep things in. And so that there's a kind of crossover with the notion of the clearing, which, in kind of my research on the zoo has been a bit of a theme where the light is used to create a clearing. And it's kind of like that sort of, I guess, dialectical tension between notions like enclosure and clearing are kind of interesting in the zoo too. Maybe not so much in the landscape you're looking at, but it's a kind of, you know, kind of interesting to think about how those words kind of play out, as you're saying. But yeah, and one more point I think that I found peculiar looking. I'm in Australia, and looking at Australian zoos, they tend to focus on Australian animals. I mean, they still have exotic animals, but it only really struck me recently how you know, the animals to Australians still kind of carry a residue of exoticism if you're non-Indigenous, because we all grew up with, you know, bunny rabbits and foxes in our books, our, you know, like our literature, European-derived literature somehow makes those animals still a kind of familiar sort of thing, whereas kangaroos and koalas still seem, wow, you know. So even though they're like, I've seen them all my life, I still kind of, you know, I'm never bored. But it's kind of interesting to think about that in relation to the African animals and what a different kind of project it is. I mean, it's obviously related, but I just wondered whether that kind of question about the sort of reversals of the meaning of keeping animals from the local environment. I mean, and you did mention that was one of the aims of one of the, or what someone thought the purpose of the zoo should be as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the interesting thing about the site is that it looks natural. I mean, now it looks natural. It's all overgrown and the grasses have come back. But in fact, if you look a bit more closely, and I'm not a botanist, but I can even tell that the species are, quite a lot of the species are not indigenous, and some of them have done very well and sort of overgrown. Some of them are indigenous, and then again, the other interesting thing about the site is that it's full of indigenous snakes. It's full of snakes, and one of the things that Sarah Omine wants to do is she wants to have this dinner party in one of the cages as part of her art project. But then when she starts setting it up, there's this huge puff adder in there, and so she has to quickly move the whole event somewhere else. I think she just moves to another cage. But it's a way in which it's a sort of, at first glance, it appears like a natural site, but in fact it has been totally worked over. Those pine trees, everything in that sort of dramatic landscape is not indigenous, except the mountain, I guess. So that is one thing. The other thing about animals, I mean, there's so much to be said about African animals and the kinds of symbolic values. I'm sorry I missed the talk this afternoon where somebody was talking about the 19th century and the symbolism of the animal. And Rhodes himself liked to see himself as the lion. He talked about the lion of Africa. So there's a weird way in which he associates with this animal. And there's a whole argument that goes on around, he sends a lion to Paul Kruger for the zoo, for the Johannesburg Zoo, and Kruger takes it as this terrible insult and sends it back because he thinks it's a sign of the British lion invading his space. So yeah, so there's a way in which these lions at the end of the 19th century really seem to not be themselves, or to behold this cultural meaning which is really in excess to their material lives. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to the enclosures, I was very, as you'll see from my titles, it's actually, I'm not entirely sure. Some of them are about what is enclosed, the traces, and some of them are about the enclosure, like the image or the photograph. And so I haven't quite yet decided what constitutes the enclosure. And so I think, you know, this is what makes the constellation so interesting, is that you can really put different things together. It allows a kind of kind of awkwardness in the way in which information is arranged, which Adorno quite liked. But I'm not sure whether I need to think through what constitutes the enclosure. I mean, is it an actual material enclosure, or is it a representation, a form of representation?
Well, I suppose it would have to be both, right? I mean, I'm thinking about, well, the way that you or the concept of the constellation in Adorno, and that it's not a representation of something else. It's a way of how each element exerts a gravitational pull on the others. I think you said, right? I mean, this it sounds to me like this is what Donna Haraway is talking about when she's talking about the figure as a string figure, as something that is not a representation of something else, but is a node in a network where things come together, and that her practice is to try to trace what are all of the different strings that come together in this particular figure. And this is would be a way of thinking, but it would be but the process of reading and even describing the figure, it would have to be always both material and semiotic. For her anyway. And so the same would be true of an enclosure, whether it's a conceptual enclosure, because the conceptual enclosures would have a material component, but the same is also true of material enclosures, which are also concepts, like material articulations of ideas about keeping something in one place and excluding something else.
Yeah.
I see that Marcella has her hand up.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. It's really inspiring to see how, the way you write. I think you asked about this at first, and I really think it's it's often overlooked and a very important aspect of theory, to write it in a way that's touching and lyric. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to ask if there is any relationship that you have thought of or you can think of with Abi Warburg's Atlas, with this Adorno's concept of configuration, and if you eventually plan to do an exhibition on this, and maybe even in this zoo.
Wow, interesting idea. I missed the name of the person, the first thing that you asked about the connection between
Abi Warburg. I'm going to write it.
Yeah, I'll write it down. I don't know that, so the answer to that is no, but it sounds interesting.
Okay. Yeah, because the idea of of his atlas was also a non-hierarchical kind of, non-chronological account of history through images. And yeah, like kind of it's named Atlas Mnemosine. So it's kind of it brings back the memory kind of part of history as well. And yeah, so maybe you can take a look at that. Maybe it can be of help.
Yeah, thank you. That definitely, that sounds very interesting. Yeah, I don't know about the exhibition. I mean, one of the reasons why the zoo isn't used for things like theatre, people have tried to turn it into a theatre, is that it doesn't have any electricity or any other infrastructural connections. I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be impossible to bring them there, but it's but it just doesn't. I mean, it's interesting to think that the zoo throughout its whole life functioned without being connected to the city's infrastructure in any way. So yes, it does make for slightly complex, it makes it difficult to do many things. And of course, there's also the snakes, which one has to keep one's eyes open for and be careful that you don't kill off your viewers. But an exhibition is a nice idea. I will definitely think about that. I see Concepcion.
Well, yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And first, now that you were mentioning the snakes, I'm going to say another thing, but the snakes are very present in Avivargus atlas that Marcela has already mentioned. So it's just well, I don't know if a happy coincidence, but I just wanted to point it out. And yeah, regarding what you were saying about constellation and also Kerry about concepts and all that, I think that and this also is related to something I did on a Spanish artist called Fina Miralles, which also was thinking with animal concepts and at the same time, like doing like a kind of a conceptual art with different kinds of actions, putting in relation some things with others. So in a way, reinforcing like concepts and working with concepts, but at the same time undermining them. And I believe this is also what I see in what you were presenting and in your enclosure, because for instance, in some of them, like in the traces one, is very obvious the thing about it not being very defined. But then, for instance, in the design, in the first moment, maybe design is like, well, a drawing, and this is like very definite and clear. But then it's something that was never built, so it has also the same duality or ambiguity in it. And I think it's something that is present in many of the enclosures you were presenting. Also, like doing this about a zoo that no longer is there, it has also all these dimensions in it, and because also zoos are places where everything is like enclosed and like trying to be categorized and very well defined, then again you were using this in order to think and undermine it. So I think this duality is present in many ways in where you were presenting. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but yeah, I wanted to comment that.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Yes, I guess it is, and this is what I was aiming for, I think, to try and to bring out some of the complexity of the relationship between the abstraction of the idea and the materiality of what it's trying to represent or capture. And Madonna, and I think I'll misquote this, but he has this nice quote where he says something about the thing never goes into its concept without leaving a remainder. And so this way in which if you're always looking at that which doesn't quite go into the concept, you see the kind of the messiness that the zoo is all, at least the language of the zoo tends to be about control and management, science, and all of these things. But the actual zoo, it can't ever match up to that. And there are many stories about Rhodes Zoo, which I didn't have space to put in, about the kind of casual violence of that imperial encounter with nature. I mean, extraordinary stories of the giraffe. He orders a giraffe from up north, and there's a part of the railway which goes through a tunnel, and they didn't think about that, and the giraffe was on the back of the of the thing, and so obviously it's killed. Head is whacked against the tunnel, and I mean, just many stories of this, both of humans, of animals being killed, this kind of carelessness, also of animals killing humans. I mean, there's a story of about one of the enclosures which had wildebeest in it, and it's just described that one person was divided up by this wildebeest into 19 pieces. No information about who the person was or what, so the sort of weird, messy, risky encounter, which is just really not the same, I think, as, and I don't know because I haven't done enough research into zoos, but it seems to be a particularly colonial inflection of the zoo. And of course, I mean, there's also the question of Rhodes and how you engage with Rhodes himself. Since the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, I mean, do we want to give him more airtime? Anyway, I mean, he's such a complex figure in South African society and now globally in society. So I have an ambivalence about writing more about him in some ways. And it's a lot to do with resources and money, I guess, in terms of, well, what interests me about the whole Rhodes Must Fall thing was how angry people were. And I suppose this is why it's interesting with the symbolic, what he symbolized, this like very ephemeral thing that he meant about how he managed to control the way in which status was organized in South African society. And that the conflict was not about the resources themselves, about his money and where it's ending up, which is not in South Africa. The money that he made out of the gold and the diamonds, the extraction, the extractive aspects of it, that wasn't where the anger was focused, which seems to me to be a more, very legitimate anger. So I'm interested in what it is that continues in today's society that makes this still a charged topic. And it's very much associated with animals and their symbolic power. I mean, as I was preparing, just as I was listening to the talks this morning, and I was thinking about this talk before I presented it, I was thinking, in some ways, you think of this whole imperial attitude towards animals as signifiers of status and value, as something that is then superseded by the idea of science and management, and what is the biology of the animal. But then you think of things like I don't know if anyone watches or did watch, what's it called, Tiger King. Tiger King then seems to be such a Rhodes-like project, both in the what is the fantasy of having these tigers, and also in the kind of messiness of the whole thing, in which it's not controlled and people get hurt and animals get hurt. There's a sort of carelessness in the whole encounter.
Definitely. I mean, I think, I can't necessarily comment on whether one should give Rhodes more airtime, but I think that there is a sense in which, we may be tired of Rhodes, but we're not done with him. To paraphrase Nietzsche, that there's a kind of a necessity to keep working through this. And what I found, one thing that I found really interesting about in your talk was this anger at him is not new, and that it is this astronomical number of oak trees or whatever that were destroyed as a proxy for him. There seems to be a kind of also a continuity in this, and that Rhodes was even then already a symbol, and not only did he want to present himself as a lion, but also came to be part of the landscape, as it were, right? And that violence against these trees stands in as as violence against him, I suppose. And then since we were talking about lions and dentists and so on earlier, I mean, Cecil the lion, as far as I know, is named after Cecil Rhodes. So the story continues also in that sense, that this name circulates in sort of unexpected constellations.
Yes, indeed. I didn't know that Cecil the lion was called after Cecil John Rhodes. That's very interesting.
I don't know this for a fact either, but I believe that I read this somewhere.
Okay. There's something I wanted to say, which I've now forgotten. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing I didn't really talk about much was the thing in the title, which I talked about, was the public, the idea of the public. And one of the interesting things which happens, I mean, one of the things Rhodes does, as I'm sure you know, is he leaves the zoo, but also the entire estate to the state. But of course, he doesn't imagine that it's going to be a liberated Black South African state. But the after effect of that is that, like much of Table Mountain, on one side of the zoo, like going round all the way to Hart Bay, is public land, not private property. Because it was farms, it would have been private property, it would have been sold off as like incredibly desirable land for high-end developments. That whole area would have been developed if people could have got their hands on it. But they couldn't. And so in some strange, twisted, and yet, way, this is now public land, which for various reasons, the state cannot sell off or develop. It has to stay as public land. And that's quite incredible. I mean, everyone uses that land. I mean, of course, historically, it was really white people who walked in those forests and on the edge of the mountain. But one of the interesting things about COVID is that totally changed, because with COVID, the parks, the little urban parks, were closed. Not that there are that many, but the mountain, after the hard lockdown, the mountain remained open. And so now it is just, I mean, on a Saturday, on a weekend, the mountain is just full of people walking in these areas. So it's interesting. I mean, he had such an idea about the public, but obviously the public is not something you can control into the future. So it is a very ambivalent legacy in many ways.
Concha, you have your hand up?
Yes, yes. As well, I was going to comment on when you also said about the messiness of the zoo, and in the sense that, but this is also a contrast with the way that the zoo tries to present itself, in the sense that it has all these categories and enclosures and classifications on all that. But then when you start to look into the zoo, then all the messiness is there, and the power relations, because you have to think about how the animals got there, for instance, and so the transport and the countries where they were brought into the zoo, and how they got there, and why do you put them there, and why you are on the other side of you are not in the cage and they are in the cage, and all these kind of things. So everything starts to get messy, and there is, well, the power relation, the violence, and all that. So I guess in a way that's something that emerged and it keeps emerging. So I guess, I mean, there is this thing going on there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's quite funny, and I mean, this novel, I don't know if anyone is familiar with it. It's called The Green Lion. I mean, what she does so cleverly is she picks up on some of these kind of debates around zoos and things that are ongoing, and she plays around with them. She has a kind of sly humor, I think, in which she engages with these things. And so at the end of the novel, the zoo is a happier place because it doesn't have any animals. It just has these taxidermied relics, which are not trying to be scientific specimens anymore because they were sort of a bit moth-eaten, and then the theatre group sort of improves them, and so they are these sort of slightly strange hybrid creatures that now occupy the lion's cage, and then the theatre group also act and perform animals. They perform the animals, and and she puts one of the people in the audience, the protagonist, overhears them say, "It's so nice to be in contact with real animals," because the children can touch the taxidermied animals and things like that. So it's very interesting the way in which
I think we've lost our speaker. Louise, are you there? You're frozen, I think. Nope. This may have put an end to our Pao, you're not going to get to ask your question now.
Yeah, maybe the power outage is back again.
Oh, she's gone. All right. Let's wait for a second and see if she rejoins. Otherwise, just send her a message. Okay. Does anybody want to talk generally about South Africa, or should we and constellations?
I do like the fact that in that short piece about the zoo that Adorno writes that's so famous, that he brings in the metaphor of Ararat, which is often overlooked in that kind of the story you were saying about the kind of, the received kind of story about the zoo. There's a kind of, interesting kind of take on Noah's Ark there, because the mountain is Ararat. So I kind of, I guess that plays to the concept of enclosure too. Like if the ark is the enclosure, and then the Ararat actually signals the kind of, the grounding of the ark and the release of the animals. It just always strikes me as kind of like nobody else says Ararat. That I've come across. It's just Adorno. I don't know. Has anyone else got any comments on those metaphors?
Here comes Louise again. Maybe she has something to say about it.
Hello, sorry about that.
Hi, welcome back. We were just talking about Ararat. Gail, do you want to?
I was just saying in that Adorno piece of writing on this in Minima Moralia on the zoo that it's always struck me as that the metaphor Adorno introduces that is often left out in relation to the zoo. And Hagenbeck, as far as I know, doesn't talk about it, but Adorno sees it as Ararat rather than, you know, the Ark or Eden or whatever. And in terms of enclosure, like the Ark is like the enclosure, and then Ararat is the sort of, you know, the thing which opens the enclosure, I suppose, that boat grounds on. And I just always thought it was kind of interesting to add to that family of metaphors, the mountain itself.
Which is very appropriate in this instance.
Yes, with Table Mountain in the background. I mean, one of the things that happens with the zoo, Nick Shepherd talks about this, is that a gate gets left open during the Second World War, and these Indian tars kind of get out onto the mountain and just proliferate. They become incredibly successful. And there are lots of them. And then after 1994, when there's a whole move towards indigenous, emphasis on indigeneity and getting rid of alien species, not sadly the settlers, but alien animal and plant species, they decide various things, and then they eventually decide they're going to hunt the tars. There's a lot of debate, but in the end they decide they're going to kill the tars. I think and I can't remember how it all pans out, but anyway, the tars are then gone officially, but apparently not really, because there's now a study to show that the tars are back. So they are still, they didn't manage to get rid of them. So yeah, interesting ways in which the attempts at management, the attempts for, you know, a kind of ideological engagement, control of the landscape according to a particular principle, often seems to be undermined or overwhelmed by somewhat more random events.
Pao, you could ask your question now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your talk as well. It was a very intriguing history to hear about. And I was also thinking, sort of, we're all talking sort of the messiness of this place, and also sort of this. I don't know. It seemed as if all the boundaries are constantly blurring. Also, sort of how it's now been taken over by nature again. And I was also wondering, sort of because it was initially known as the Rhodes Menagerie, but now it's known as the Groote Schuur, which is like the big shed, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I found that also an interesting sort of shift, also when you think about sort of enclosure and what that might mean, because like a shed is, I don't know, I suppose it's more agricultural in a way, but it's also a messier place than, well, not necessarily, but sort of it can be interpreted as a messier place than, for instance, a zoo, in which indeed everything is sort of taxonomically correct and hierarchical. And I was sort of wondering, when does that change from, like, is that when Rhodes himself sort of disappears from the picture, or?
No, actually, so the Groote Schuur refers to the entire estate, and in fact, Rhodes liked it. It was the name of one of the farms, I think. Sort of big barn, I think it means. And it's one of the farms, and Rhodes chooses that one because he buys up all these farms around the edge of Table Mountain. And then he has this vision that he's now got a kind of English country estate, and he does all of this thing with perspectives and lines and planting trees and things. But he chooses that he wants that to be the name. I'm not absolutely sure about what he called the zoo. I mean, whether he called it a menagerie, and that's why it's called Rhodes' Menagerie. And I'm not sure if that was ever its official name, or I think by the time it gets to being bequeathed to the city, it's just known as the zoo on Groote Schuur Estate, so it's known as Groote Schuur Zoo. Yeah, so it's not quite, it doesn't make that kind of simple.
Even the name is a bit messy in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. And yeah. I mean, the zoo itself is, I showed you a slide right at the beginning, but it was probably quite quick. It's the little bit of the zoo is very ordered, it's like very symmetrical, and it's got all these bits to it. But then it's part of a much bigger, the estate itself is more messy again, you know, with these different paddocks, different animals inhabiting different bits of it. Yeah.
So it is 7 o'clock, at least where I am. And I'm wondering if there are still questions for our speaker. Otherwise, I would recommend that we break out of this particular enclosure and call it a night. And I will see many of you again tomorrow. But before we do that, I would like to thank once again Louise Green for this really excellent talk. She's given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure we will continue to talk about it in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your feedback. It's been very helpful.